That cooperation, which is based on division of labor, assumes its typical form in manufacture, and is the prevalent characteristic form of the capitalist process of production throughout the manufacturing period properly so called. That period, roughly speaking, extends from the middle of the H to the last third of the H century. Manufacture takes its rise in two ways: by the assemblage, in one workshop under the control of a single capitalist, of laborers belonging to various independent handicrafts, but through whose hands a given article must pass on its way to completion. A carriage, for example, was formerly the product of the labor of a great number of independent artificers, such as wheelwrights, harness makers, tailors, locksmiths, upholsterers, turners, fringe makers, glaziers, painters, polishers, gilders, and in the manufacture of carriages, however, all these different artificers are assembled in one building where they work into one another's hand. It is true that a carriage cannot be gilt before it has been made. But if a number of carriages are being made simultaneously, some may be in the hands of the gilders while others are going through an earlier process. So far, we are still in the domain of simple cooperation, which finds its materials ready to hand in the shape of men and things. But very soon an important change takes place. The tailor, the locksmith, and the other artificers, being now exclusively occupied in carriage making, each gradually loses, through want of practice, the ability to carry on to its full extent his old handicraft. But on the other hand, his activity, now confined in one groove, assumes the form best adapted to the narrowed sphere of action. At first, carriage manufacture is a combination of various independent handicrafts. By degrees, it becomes the splitting up of carriage making into its various detail processes, each of which crystallizes into the exclusive function of a particular workman, the manufacture, as a whole, being carried on by the men in conjunction. In the same way, cloth manufacture, as also a whole series of other manufactures, arose by combining different handicrafts together under the control of a single capitalist. Manufacture also arises in a way exactly the reverse of this, namely, by one capitalist employing simultaneously in one workshop a number of artificers, who all do the same, or the same kind of work, such as making paper, type, or needle. This is cooperation in its most elementary form. Each of these artificers makes the entire commodity, and he consequently performs in succession all the operations necessary for its production. He still works in his old handicraft-like way. But very soon external circumstances cause a different use to be made of the concentration of the workmen on one spot, and of the simultaneousness of their work. An increased quantity of the article has perhaps to be delivered within a given time. The work is therefore redistributed. Instead of each man being allowed to perform all the various operations in succession, these operations are changed into disconnected, isolated ones, carried on side by side. Each is assigned to a different artificer, and the whole of them together are performed simultaneously by the cooperating workmen. This accidental repartition gets repeated, develops advantages of its own, and gradually ossifies into a systematic division of labor. The commodity, from being the individual product of an independent artificer, becomes the social product of a union of artificers, each of whom performs one, and only one, of the constituent partial operations. The same operations which, in the case of a papermaker belonging to a German guild, merged one into the other as the successive acts of one artificer, became in the Dutch paper manufacture so many partial operations carried on side by numerous cooperating laborers. The needle-maker of the Nuremberg Guild was the cornerstone on which the English needle manufacture was raised. But while in Nuremberg that single artificer performed a series of perhaps operations one after another, in England it was not long before there were needle-makers side by side, each performing one alone of those operations, and in consequence of further experience, each of those operations was again split up, isolated, and made the exclusive function of a separate work. The mode in which manufacture arises, its growth out of handicrafts, is therefore twofold. On the one hand, it arises from the union of various independent handicrafts, which become stripped of their independence and specialized to such an extent as to be reduced to mere supplementary partial processes in the production of one particular commodity. On the other hand, it arises from the cooperation of artificers of one handicraft. It splits up that particular handicraft into its various detail operations, isolating, and making these operations independent of one another up to the point where each becomes the exclusive function of a particular laborer. On the one hand, therefore, manufacture either introduces division of labor into a process of production, or further develops that division. On the other hand, it unites together handicrafts that were formerly separate. But whatever may have been its particular starting point, its final form is invariably the same, a productive mechanism whose parts are human beings. For a proper understanding of the division of labor in manufacture, it is essential that the following points be firmly grasped. First, the decomposition of a process of production into its various successive steps coincides, here, strictly with the resolution of a handicraft into its successive manual operation. Whether complex or simple, each operation has to be done by hand, retains the character of a handicraft, and is therefore dependent on the strength, skill, quickness, and sureness of the individual workman in handling his tool. A handicraft continues to be the basis. This narrow technical basis excludes a really scientific analysis of any definite process of industrial production, since it is still a condition that each detailed process gone through by the product must be capable of being done by hand and of forming, in its way, a separate handicraft. It is just because handicraft skill continues in this way to be the foundation of the process of production that each workman becomes exclusively assigned to a partial function, and that for the rest of his life, his labor power is turned into the organ of this detail function. Secondly, this division of labor is a particular sort of cooperation, and many of its disadvantages spring from the general character of cooperation, and not from this particular form of it. If we now go more into detail, it is, in the first place, clear that a laborer who all his life performs one and the same simple operation converts his whole body into the automatic, specialized implement of that operation. Consequently, he takes less time in doing it than the artificer who performs a whole series of operations in succession. But the collective laborer, who constitutes the living mechanism of manufacture, is made up solely of such specialized detail labor. Hence, in comparison with the independent handicraft, more is produced in a given time, or the productive power of labor is increased. Moreover, when once this fractional work is established as the exclusive function of one person, the methods it employs become perfect. The workman's continued repetition of the same simple act, and the concentration of his attention on it, teach him by experience how to attain the desired effect with the minimum of exertion. But since there are always several generations of laborers living at one time, and working together at the manufacture of a given article, the technical skill, the tricks of the trade thus acquired, become established, and are accumulated and handed down. Manufacture, in fact, produces the skill of the detail laborer, by reproducing and systematically driving to an extreme within the workshop the naturally developed differentiation of trades which it found ready to hand in society at large. On the other hand, the conversion of fractional work into the life calling of one man corresponds to the tendency shown by earlier societies to make trades hereditary, either to petrify them into castes, or whenever definite historical conditions beget in the individual a tendency to vary in a manner incompatible with the nature of castes, to ossify them into guilds. Castes and guilds arise from the action of the same natural law that regulates the differentiation of plants and animals into species and varieties, except that, when a certain degree of development has been reached, the heredity of castes and the exclusiveness of guilds are ordained as a law of society. It is only the special skill accumulated from generation to generation, and transmitted from father to son, that gives to the Hindu, as it does to the spider, this proficiency. And yet the work of such a Hindu weaver is very complicated, compared with that of a manufacturing laborer. An artificer, who performs one after another the various fractional operations in the production of a finished article, must at one time change his place, at another his tool. The transition from one operation to another interrupts the flow of his labor, and creates, so to say, gaps in his working day. These gaps close up so soon as he is tied to one and the same operation all day long. They vanish in proportion as the changes in his work diminish. The resulting increased productive power is owing either to an increased expenditure of labor power in a given time, to increased intensity of labor, or to a decrease in the amount of labor power unproductively consumed. The extra expenditure of power, demanded by every transition from rest to motion, is made up for by prolonging the duration of the normal velocity when once acquired. On the other hand, constant labor of one uniform kind disturbs the intensity and flow of a man's animal spirits, which find recreation and delight in mere change of activity. The productiveness of labor depends not only on the proficiency of the workman, but on the perfection of his tools. Tools of the same kind, such as knives, drills, gimlets, hammers, and may be employed in different processes, and the same tool may serve various purposes in a single process. But so soon as the different operations of a labor process are disconnected the one from the other, and each fractional operation acquires in the hands of the detail laborer a suitable and peculiar form, alterations become necessary in the implements that previously served more than one purpose. The direction taken by this chain is determined by the difficulties experienced in consequence of the unchanged form of the implement. Manufacture is characterized by the differentiation of the instruments of labor, a differentiation whereby implements of a given sort acquire fixed shapes, adapted to each particular application, and by the specialization of those instruments, giving to each special implement its full play only in the hands of a specific detail laborer. In Birmingham, alone varieties of hammers are produced, and not only is each adapted to one particular process, but several varieties often serve exclusively for the different operations in one and the same process. The manufacturing period simplifies, improves, and multiplies the implements of labor by adapting them to the exclusively special functions of each detail laborer. It thus creates at the same time one of the material conditions for the existence of machinery, which consists of a combination of simple instruments. The detail laborer and his implements are the simplest elements of manufacture. Let us now turn to its aspect as a whole. The organization of manufacture has two fundamental forms which, in spite of occasional blending, are essentially different in kind, and moreover, play very distinct parts in the subsequent transformation of manufacture into modern industry carried on by machinery. This double character arises from the nature of the article produced. This article either results from the mere mechanical fitting together of partial products made independently, or owes its completed shape to a series of connected processes and manipulation. A locomotive, for instance, consists of more than independent parts. It cannot, however, serve as an example of the first kind of genuine manufacture, for it is a structure produced by modern mechanical industry. But a watch can, and William Petty used it to illustrate the division of labor in manufacture. Formerly the individual work of a Nuremberg artificer, the watch has been transformed into the social product of an immense number of detail laborers, such as mainspring makers, dial makers, spiral spring makers, jeweled hole makers, ruby lever makers, hand makers, case makers, screw makers, gilders, with numerous subdivisions, such as wheel makers, pin makers, movement makers, écvoire de pignon, pivot makers, planteur de finissage, finisseur de barrelet, escapement makers, cylinder makers for cylinder escapements, escapement wheel makers, balance wheel makers, raquette makers, the planteur de chapment. Then the ripseur de barrelet, steel polishers, wheel polishers, screw polishers, figure painters, dial enamelers, fabricant dependents, finisseur de charnière, faiseur de secret, graveur, ciseleur, polisseur de boîte, and last of all the repousseur, who fits together the whole watch and hands it over in a going state. Only a few parts of the watch pass through several hands, and all these membra disjecta come together for the first time in the hand that binds them into one mechanical whole. This external relation between the finished product and its various and diverse elements makes it, as well in this case as in the case of all similar finished articles, a matter of chance whether the detail laborers are brought together in one workshop or not. The detail operations may further be carried on like so many independent handicrafts, as they are in the cantons of Vaud and Neufchâtel, while in Geneva there exist large watch manufactories, where the detail laborers directly cooperate under the control of a single capitalist. And even in the latter case the dial, the springs, and the case are seldom made in the factory itself. Carry on the trade as a manufacture, with concentration of workmen, is, in the watch trade, profitable only under exceptional conditions, because competition is greater between the laborers who desire to work at home, and because the splitting up of the work into a number of heterogeneous processes permits but little use of the instruments of labor in common, and the capitalist, by scattering the work, saves the outlay on workshops, and nevertheless the position of this detail laborer, though he works at home, does so for a capitalist, is very different from that of the independent artificer, who works for his own customer. The second kind of manufacture, its perfected form, produces articles that go through connected phases of development, through a series of processes step by step, like the wire in the manufacture of needles, which passes through the hands of, and sometimes even different detail workmen. In so far as such a manufacture, when first started, combines scattered handicrafts, it lessens the space by which the various phases of production are separated from each other. The time taken in passing from one stage to another is shortened, so is the labor that effectuates this passage. In comparison with a handicraft, productive power is gained, and this gain is owing to the general cooperative character of manufacture. On the other hand, Division of labor, which is the distinguishing principle of manufacture, requires the isolation of the various stages of production and their independence of each other. The establishment and maintenance of a connection between the isolated functions necessitates the incessant transport of the article from one hand to another, and from one process to another. From the standpoint of modern mechanical industry, this necessity stands forth as a characteristic and costly disadvantage, and one that is immanent in the principle of manufacture. If we confine our attention to some particular lot of raw materials, of rags, for instance, in paper manufacture, or of wire and needle manufacture, we perceive that it passes in succession through a series of stages in the hands of the various detail workmen until completion. On the other hand, if we look at the workshop as a whole, we see the raw material in all the stages of its production at the same time. The collective laborer, with one set of his many hands armed with one kind of tools, draws the wire with another set armed with different tools. He, at the same time, straightens it. With another, he cuts it. With another, points it, and so on. The different detail processes, which were successive in time, have become simultaneous, go on side by side in space. Hence, production of a greater quantum of finished commodities in a given time. This simultaneity, it is true, is due to the general cooperative form of the process as a whole, but manufacture not only finds the conditions for cooperation ready to hand, it also, to some extent, creates them by the subdivision of handicraft labor. On the other hand, it accomplishes this social organization of the labor process only by riveting each laborer to a single fractional detail. Since the fractional product of each detail laborer is, at the same time, only a particular stage in the development of one and the same finished article, each laborer or each group of laborers prepares the raw material for another laborer or group. The result of the labor of the one is the starting point for the labor of the other. The one workman, therefore, gives occupation directly to the other. The labor time necessary in each partial process for attaining the desired effect is learnt by experience, and the mechanism of manufacture as a whole is based on the assumption that a given result will be obtained in a given time. It is only on this assumption that the various supplementary labor processes can proceed uninterruptedly, simultaneously, and side by side. It is clear that this direct dependence of the operations, and therefore of the laborers on each other, compels each one of them to spend on his work no more than the necessary time, and thus a continuity, uniformity, regularity, order, and even intensity of labor, of quite a different kind, is begotten than is to be found in an independent handicraft or even in simple cooperation. The rule that the labor time expended on a commodity should not exceed that which is socially necessary for its production appears in the production of commodities generally to be established by the mere effect of competition, since, to express ourselves superficially, each single producer is obliged to sell his commodity at its market price. In manufacture, on the contrary, the turning out of a given quantum of product in a given time is a technical law of the process of production itself. Different operations take, however, unequal periods and yield, therefore, in equal times unequal quantities of fractional products. If therefore the same laborer has, day after day, to perform the same operation, there must be a different number of laborers for each operation. For instance, in type manufacture, there are 4 founders and 2 breakers to 1 rubber. The founder casts type an hour, the breaker breaks up, and the rubber polishes. Here we have again the principle of cooperation in its simplest form, the simultaneous employment of many doing the same thing. Only now, this principle is the expression of an organic relation. The division of labor, as carried out in manufacture, not only simplifies and multiplies the qualitatively different parts of the social collective laborer, but also creates a fixed mathematical relation or ratio which regulates the quantitative extent of those parts, the relative number of laborers, or the relative size of the group of laborers, for each detail operation. It develops, along with the qualitative subdivision of the social labor process, a quantitative rule and proportionality for that process. When once the most fitting proportion has been experimentally established for the numbers of the detail laborers in the various groups when producing on a given scale, that scale can be extended only by employing a multiple of each particular group. There is this to boot, that the same individual can do certain kinds of work just as well on a large as on a small scale. For instance, the labor of superintendence, the carriage of the fractional product from one stage to the next, and the isolation of such functions, their allotment to a particular laborer, does not become advantageous till after an increase in the number of laborers employed, but this increase must affect every group proportionally. The isolated group of laborers to whom any particular detail function is assigned is made up of homogeneous elements and is one of the constituent parts of the total mechanism. In many manufactures, however, the group itself is an organized body of labor, the total mechanism being a repetition or multiplication of these elementary organisms. Take, for instance, the manufacture of glass bottles. It may be resolved into three essentially different stages. First, the preliminary stage, consisting of the preparation of the components of the glass, mixing the sand and lime, and melting them into a fluid mass of glass. Various detail laborers are employed in this first stage, as also in the final one of removing the bottles from the drying furnace, sorting and packing them, and in the middle between these two stages comes the glass melting proper, the manipulation of the fluid mass. At each mouth of the furnace there works a group called the whole, consisting of one bottle maker or finisher, one blower, one gatherer, one putter-up or wetter-off, and one taker-in. These 5 detail workers are so many special organs of a single working organism that acts only as a whole, and therefore can operate only by the direct cooperation of the whole 5. The whole body is paralyzed if but one of its members be wanting. But a glass furnace has several openings, each of which contains an earthenware melting pot full of molten glass, and employs a similar 5-membered group of workers. The organization of each group is based on division of labor, but the bond between the different groups is simple cooperation, which, by using in common one of the means of production, the furnace, causes it to be more economically consumed. Such a furnace, with its groups, constitutes a glass house, and a glass manufactory comprises a number of such glass houses, together with the apparatus and workmen requisite for the preparatory and final stages. Finally, just as manufacture arises in part from the combination of various handicrafts, so too it develops into a combination of various manufactures. The larger English glass manufacturers, for instance, make their own earthenware melting pots, because on the quality of these depends to a great extent the success or failure of the process. The manufacture of one of the means of production is here united with that of the product. On the other hand, the manufacture of the product may be united with other manufactures, of which that product is the raw material, or with the products of which it is itself subsequently mixed. Thus, we find the manufacture of flint glass combined with that of glass cutting and brass founding, the latter for the metal settings of various articles of glass. The various manufactures so combined form more or less separate departments of a larger manufacture, but are at the same time independent processes, each with its own division of labor. In spite of the many advantages offered by this combination of manufactures, it never grows into a complete technical system on its own foundation. That happens only on its transformation into an industry carried on by machinery. Early in the manufacturing period, the principle of lessening the necessary labor time in the production of commodities was accepted and formulated, and the use of machines, especially for certain simple first processes that have to be conducted on a very large scale, and with the application of great force, sprang up here and there. Thus, at an early period in paper manufacture, the tearing up of the rags was done by paper mills, and in metal works, the pounding of the ores was effected by stamping mill. The Roman Empire had handed down the elementary form of all machinery in the waterwheel. The handicraft period bequeathed to us the great inventions of the compass, of gunpowder, of type printing, and of the automatic clock. But on the whole, machinery played that subordinate part which Adam Smith assigns to it in comparison with division of labor. The sporadic use of machinery in the 8th century was of the greatest importance, because it supplied the great mathematicians of that time with a practical basis and stimulant to the creation of the science of mechanics. The collective laborer, formed by the combination of a number of detail laborers, is the machinery specially characteristic of the manufacturing period. The various operations that are performed in turns by the producer of a commodity and coalesce one with another during the progress of production, lay claim to him in various ways. In one operation he must exert more strength, in another more skill, in another more attention, and the same individual does not possess all these qualities in an equal degree. After manufacture has once separated, made independent, and isolated the various operations, the laborers are divided, classified, and grouped according to their predominating qualities. If their natural endowments are, on the one hand, the foundation on which the division of labor is built up, on the other hand, manufacture, once introduced, develops in them new powers that are by nature fitted only for limited and special functions. The collective laborer now possesses, in an equal degree of excellence, all the qualities requisite for production, and expends them in the most economical manner, by exclusively employing all his organs, consisting of particular laborers or groups of laborers, in performing their special function. The one-sidedness and the deficiencies of the detail laborer become perfections when he is a part of the collective laborer. The habit of doing only one thing converts him into a never-failing instrument, while his connection with the whole mechanism compels him to work with the regularity of the parts of a machine. Since the collective laborer has functions, both simple and complex, both high and low, his members, the individual labor powers, require different degrees of training and must therefore have different value. Manufacture, therefore, develops a hierarchy of labor powers, to which there corresponds a scale of wages. If on the one hand, the individual laborers are appropriated and annexed for life by a limited function, on the other hand, the various operations of the hierarchy are parceled out among the laborers according to both their natural and their acquired capabilities. Every process of production, however, requires certain simple manipulations, which every man is capable of doing. They too are now severed from their connection with the more pregnant moments of activity, and ossified into exclusive functions of specially appointed labor. Hence, manufacture begets, in every handicraft that it seizes upon, a class of so-called unskilled laborers, a class which handicraft industry strictly excluded. If it develops a one-sided speciality into a perfection, at the expense of the whole of a man's working capacity, it also begins to make a speciality of the absence of all development. Alongside of the hierarchic gradation, there steps the simple separation of the laborers into skilled and unskilled. For the latter, the cost of apprenticeship vanishes, for the former, it diminishes, compared with that of artificers, in consequence of the functions being simplified. In both cases the value of labor power falls. An exception to this law holds good whenever the decomposition of the labor process begets new and comprehensive functions that either had no place at all, or only a very modest one, in handicrafts. The fall in the value of labor power, caused by the disappearance or diminution of the expenses of apprenticeship, implies a direct increase of surplus value for the benefit of capital, for everything that shortens the necessary labor time required for the reproduction of labor power extends the domain of surplus labor.